Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to have a siesta with us. And today we have a different talk regarding what you may be used to. We're going to talk about the technical considerations regarding data protection in what happened in the Catalan independence referendum in 2017. So we're going to talk about this. But first of all, let's introduce ourselves. Thank you, Álvarez, and thank you, Rooted, for having us here. I have a PhD in constitutional law, and I come from two universities, the University of León. Right now I'm working at the University of Vigo as a constitutional law teacher. I think that is the most relevant thing I could tell about me. The important guy is my colleague here. Not really important. I think that you all know me. I do have a PhD in IT by the University of Zaragoza. I work for the Ministry of Defense, and I do binary analysis and security in contactless credit cards. Okay, so first of all, before we begin, because this is a bit controversial, I think that you are all here to throw eggs at us or to learn something, right? So first of all, there's a little disclaimer. We think that everyone has a right to participate and to vote freely in a legal referendum. Also think that no one is above the laws. And of course, we think the referendum must have minimum guarantees to be accepted internationally as a legal referendum. And here you have a reference about a technical report of the Venice Committee talking about that minimum set of rules that we could expect. I'd also like to thank people who are not here. To remind people who are not here, the only immutable laws are the physical laws of nature. Politicians need to do their work, which is to do politics, basically, to change the laws without committing any illegality. And here we consider a legal point of view with regard to the Spanish Constitution, which is a valid legal text in Spain. Therefore, we have a great doctor with us, a great PhD in constitutional law. And the first thing that you learn today is quite interesting. It's not technical, because the first presentation or the first part will deal with the Spanish Constitution, and we live in Spain, and we have certain laws, certain constitutional laws that were hard to get for our forefathers, and we should know about it. I was new in this, to be honest, and until I began talking about this with Tamara, I didn't quite understand this. And last, I'd like to highlight with Tamara that our constitution, unlike the German constitution, for example, may be changed. In fact, you know about that, because a few years ago there was a change. And there are constitutions such as the German one that have intangible clauses. That means that those constitutions are that way forever, pretty much. However, that doesn't happen in the Spanish Constitution. Having said that, this is the agenda of today's presentation. First, Tamara will tell you about the Spanish Constitution. You can sleep for about half an hour if you wish. And then we're going to tell you about the political conflict, the history and the timeline of what happened. She'll talk about the electoral census and data protection principles, and then I'm going to focus on the technical part from the perspective of censorship and anti-censorship, to mention all the techniques used for the October 1st referendum. And then Tamara will talk about the legal implications, and then we'll give the conclusions. Okay, so by then it will be time to wake up from your nap. But Ricardo was saying that it might be important to understand the basis of the constitutional law. to better understand what happened on October 1st and where we can begin this and where that conflict led to. However, to do so, we must begin with some data regarding our constitutional system first. The enforcement of our supreme norm. As you may know, it came into force on December 29, 1978. And it's important to remember that it was ratified by the Spanish people on December 6, 1978 in a referendum. Which was participation in that referendum? Well, if we go to the whole of national territory, we have a participation of around 67.1% of the electoral census, that is, of the people with the right to vote. From that percentage, the federal vote, the people who voted positively to the Constitution, is about 87.78%. Therefore, that's a 58% of a vote over the total of the electoral centres. If we go to Catalan sphere, these percentages are slightly higher, more or less. Around 68% of Catalonian people went to vote to that referendum on December 6th, so showing our support of around 90.5% in favour of the Constitution, showing an approach of about, or an involvement of about 61%. And we should take into account that our constitutional text has been influenced by other constitutions from abroad. As we can see here, from German constitutionalism, we have quite a few things. The actual constitutional guarantee system and the constitutional court, which is quite important, and I'm sure that it sounds familiar. Article 155 and the core city federalism came from the German constitution. And regarding data protection, the Portuguese influence is quite interesting. In Article 18.4, the French constitution also gives us the organic regulation leading to the approval of the statutes of autonomy. Here we have Mexico as well regarding social rights, Italy with the principle of material equality in Article 9.2 of the Spanish Constitution. However, we look at the historical tradition of Spain. The biggest influence might come from the Republican Constitution of 1931. And in Title 8 it talks about the 17 autonomous communities and about the voluntary principle. And through these two questions, the 17 autonomous communities were created, as well as the 2 autonomous cities. Without too many details, I can actually say that there are 2 important ways to create an autonomy. We're not going to talk about the particularities or the exceptions. We have the fast way of Article 151 and transitory paragraph 4 and 5, and then the slow way in section 143 and 48.2. That means that the slow way had a lower competence gap. However, the fast way would have a higher competence gap, and for approving that autonomy, they would need a referendum of their project for a statute of autonomy. And what is the statute of autonomy? Well, it is a basic rule of the territorial entity of the autonomous community. It is an organic law, specific, special, backed and approved by the Parliament of the nation. It is a national law, therefore, and that's why it's in a special position within the pyramid, within the legal order. And the autonomy is acquired with the approval of its own statute of autonomy. But let's go to other elements of constitutional law. And here we have the system of competence division of matters. Our constitutionalism is very asymmetric, and that is also transferred to the division of powers and competencies. That way we establish the so-called constitutionality block, made by the Constitution and the Statutes of Autonomy mentioned earlier. And this asymmetry is in the constitutional block, which is positive in two important constitutional precepts, Articles 148 and 149, shared competencies and exclusive competencies of the state, respectively. This competence system has established a closure clause, including in section 149.3 the following: those matters that are not attributed expressly to the state by the Constitution are available for the autonomies. However, to do so, the statutes of autonomy should embed them expressly. Otherwise, and this is an important part, it is established that those competitions will belong to the state. Why? Because we have something that is not there and something that is not in the statutes of autonomy. The autonomous communities have the capability to make laws and their executive and legislative power. What happens is both chambers of both parliaments, legislate over a matter that hasn't been attributed expressly to any of them, that the actual state law will prevail on the autonomic law. That's the so-called prevalence clause. And we have other interesting matters. In our constitutional law, we consider the following: Article 2 of the Spanish Constitution. Autonomy is not sovereignty. National sovereignty, as stated by the Constitutional Court and kept by our Constitution, is linked to the whole of the citizens, to all the citizens of the Spanish state. And we have other interesting bits. Article 145 of the Spanish Constitution forbids the federation of the autonomous communities. Ricardo was saying that we don't have a intangibility clause. We can actually modify anything we want in the Spanish Constitution, whatever we want. And there are other interesting elements. The representation of the territorial interests should begin or should be more deeply rooted in the representation chamber of those interests, which is the Senate. That's where we should begin debating seriously on these kind of circumstances that we have experienced. And there is not in our constitutional text, there is no right to self-determination. However, it could be added, the reform of the constitution does exist. And the autonomous communities are subject as well to the jurisdiction principle stated in Article 153 of the Spanish Constitution. And earlier we talked about two ways of accessing autonomy, the fast way and the slow way. Catalonia is created as an autonomous community through the fast way. Second transition provision and competencies of sections 152.2. That means that the Catalan Statute of Autonomy, in this case, need to submit their statute project to a referendum. So on October 25th, 1979, they submitted their statute to a referendum to be approved as an organic law in national parliament. And which are the participation data of that referendum? If we go to the official data, we have about 59.7% of the participation vote in February. That is altogether 88.2%, meaning about 52 or 53% of positive votes for that bill. However, if we go to the referendum to reform the Statute of Autonomy in August 2006, those percentages do change slightly. That Statute of Autonomy foresees its reform through the celebration of a referendum. Not everyone needs to have it, but here they have it. I do apologize, I need to have a quick drink of water.
Bueno, esos porcentajes de votación aproximados son en torno al 48%.
And those approximate voting percentages render a 48.9% of participation, 73.2% were favourable votes, and that is altogether a 35.8% of the total census in favour of the Statute of Autonomy. And I'm talking about that reform in 2006 because that's one of the origins of the conflict in Catalonia. And why does this have to do with October 1st? I'm going to explain that. Because we actually have a statute project approved in the Catalan Parliament and ratified by about 35-36% of Catalonian people, and approved of the National Parliament by Organic Law 6/2006 by the Statute of Autonomy. However, using Article 163 of the Spanish Constitution, several members of Parliament, in this case from the Spanish Partido Popular, do appeal to the constitutionality of the Statute of Autonomy, and there's a ruling of the Constitutional Court in 2010 declaring as unconstitutional 14 precepts of the Statute of Autonomy out of a total of 123 articles in the Statute of Autonomy, without taking into account the provisions in it. And other unconstitutionality appeals are presented, were lodged by other parties and other autonomies. Thank you much. I kind of forgot to go to the next slide. So we do have this situation here, and we get to the beginning of the independence process in Catalonia. What happens, or which are the matters that we could see there? What happens, in fact, with the Statute of Autonomy, and in this period that leads to October 1st, 2017, that the cat kind of gets out. That's right. We have a conflict that is economical/political, at a period of economic crisis, and institutional crisis, as well as a political crisis, and that conflict leads into a judicial political conflict, and that's where the responsibility begins. First, as we'll see next, we can see that regarding citizen participation, that leads to the right of self-determination, and that determines secession unilaterally of the autonomous community of Catalonia. So we're going from words political to judicial political. And I distinguish two states, one until 2015, 2016 more or less, and then 2017, 2018. Thank you for going to the next slide. So what happens in this first stage? Up to 2015, well, the Constitutional Court had been warned about several matters regarding the separatist process. First of all, several things regarding the beginning of terms 10th and 11th of the Catalan Parliament. The first one declares sovereignty to the people of Catalonia, and the second one, the process of segregation or independence of Catalonia begins. They were also warned about the unconstitutionality of 3 parts of 2 articles of Law 10/2014 of non-referendum popular consultations that would lead to what is known as the 9N, November 9th, and also regarding the presidency decrees that were related to that first consultation. Therefore, we can see that this conflict has to do mainly with 2 matters. First, related to the principle of unity and sovereignty, and secondly, with the democratic principle or participatory principle, it is important to understand that the Constitutional Court talks about constitutional loyalty and other important matters in that first stage. Okay, I think one of the slides might be in the wrong place, but in this first stage of the participation, the non-referendum or the popular consultation, to distinguish it from the referendum, here the Constitutional Court rules on the unconstitutionality on that Catalan process through two main ideas. Some substantive reasons, that is, say that such consultations that are not a referendum are leading to call the citizenship to vote with the guarantees that they're trying to implement as if it was a referendum. Therefore, it has a referendum form, and that is either a consultation or a referendum. We cannot play with that ambiguity. That's what it says. And on the other hand, we have material reasons. So this is not a consultation, but rather, even though being a consultation, it leads to a referendum consultation, then we go to the Constitution, and Article 149 talks about the exclusive competencies of the state. In Part 1, Element 32, it says that this should be done by the state, and that was not happening here. However, if we take as the basis that what they were trying to do here entails a relationship with the principles of unity and sovereignty, the competence for that pertains only to the state. That's what the Constitutional Court says. In Article 92 of the Spanish Constitution, it states those especially transcendental political matters may be subject to a referendum of the whole of the Spanish people, not just a part of them. And here the Constitutional Court refers them to Article 2. So given the impossibility of carrying out a consultation on this matter and carrying out an autonomic referendum on this matter, we now get to the second stage. And what happens here in 2016? Well, the kitting is even more sad. Why? Because the Catalan Parliament approves two laws, Law 19 and Law 20 from 2017. The first one for the referendum of self-determination, and Law 20, 2017, regarding the legal and foundational transitoriness of the Republic, knowing that the Constitutional Court had ruled on the unconstitutionality on the process according to the principles of constitutional loyalty and national sovereignty that I just mentioned. Therefore, the nation government, using the 161 precept, appeals the unconstitutionality of both laws, and if we go to the constitutional text, that entails the immediate suspension or the appeal of those two laws. However, the Constitutional Court ratifies that suspension, that cancellation, and the constitutional guarantee machinery begins, and through different provisions and writs, they communicate to the Catalan authorities related to the process that they cannot act according to the referendum of October 1st, 2017. And it is important to know, I'm clicking on it, but apparently I need to click on it several times. Yes, but we need to know that in those writs or orders from September 2017, in an explicit way, the Constitutional Court talks to different Catalan authorities saying that they cannot create census of files to carry out the October 1st referendum, and later on I'll explain that part more in detail. And what does this appeal entail? Two rulings from the Constitutional Court that are quite important, 114 and 124 from 2017, declaring the unconstitutionality of both laws under the same principles that were made explicit in 2015. This is quite interesting because they're trying to turn on the regulatory hierarchy principle, and they wanted to have a law above the constitution but also above the basic Catalan constitutional rule. Then they're not only respecting the constitution but also the territorial rule, which is quite remarkable here. But anyway, I don't want to bore you with these matters. And unconstitutionality is declared, and you all saw the news on that date. And this is how we get to October 1st, 2017. There was some sort of participation, but for a constitutionalist, this slide would be blank. For a political expert, it would have a lot of data. And I'll say why some people may think that it's blank, because there are no constitutional guarantees on that referendum, or non-referendum, because it had been cancelled, it couldn't take place. Therefore, you all know what happened. I don't need to explain this for too long.
Nos vamos al segundo.
We move on to the second item. We know that on the 1st of October, what happened then in that the Catalan Parliament, together with the Generalitat, drove or pushed for the celebration of this referendum. So we have to ask, what is needed to hold the referendum? We need an electoral census, and what's in the electoral census? Well, we need the data about the people who are entitled to vote. In this case, in Catalonia. And how do you generate this census? Well, we have to go to the organic law, whose Article 31 says that this electoral census is of a public state property, and it is created through the aggregation of data from the municipal censuses that cannot be given for free, but that they have to be subject to a number of principles, and we can link that with data protection. So first, the principles of competence and legality, then consent, and then purpose. The organic law for data protection from 1999. We're going to see that there are a number of conditions that have we met with sensitive data. So if we start from the fact that this is a file whose owner is the state, do you believe that with everything that has happened before, the state is going to just graciously hand over that part of the electoral census? Of course not. But the Parliament of Catalonia and the Generalitat were behind the whole operation, and therefore they had they were ready for this possibility. Do you remember the law 19/2017? It already described that the electoral census was going to be dropped for Catalonia, and the Constitutional Court, in the Basque case, had said that it was not possible to have an autonomous census, because that is a state census and it belongs to the state. So if we go to that doctrine of the Constitutional Court, it could not be done. It was against the Constitution. In that law, together with the decree that developed this, 140/2017, it is stated that there's going to be a Catalan administration, electoral administration, and and that this administration, so the state is not going to grant us this data. And the second question we have to ask is, then how are you going to obtain those data? And that's when we start to consider different possibilities. One, through the copy of the electoral census that had been legally granted by the state for the performance of the self-governing communities of 2015 or the general elections of 2016. And how was the census generated? Well, through the data of the municipal census. So perhaps some municipalities had data about their inhabitants, but let's remember the data protection law principles, which establishes how this data can be handed over. And there are and if you remember Article 7 of sensitive data, those data connected with healthcare, this is a self-governing community power, just like in the taxes that are collected in the self-governing communities. Okay, thanks very much, Tamara. I think everybody is clear. When Abel is talking about ensamblers, it's shocking how much information he has in his head, and the same thing applies here with her about articles. And so the more technical part to do with censorship and censorship resistance techniques used on the 1st of October. There are people around here that will know more than I do about this, but anyway, on the 6th of September 2017, there was a web page published, referendum.com, where there was information about how this process was going to take place. In this web page, there was no information as to where people should go for vote. A week later, the Court of First Instance of Barcelona issued an official request to block the access to this web page after or following an official request by the Civil War Guard. And this is where the cat and mouse game started. Put them on, announced in Twitter a number of web pages that were a copy of the one that had just been blocked. These are the two examples. Rev1 Oct, and that's where he announced where you could access that web page. Just a bit later, a week later, there was information about another web page where you could you inform people directly where they could vote, and this is the first time in which it was made public through the Twitter account of Carles Puigdemont. This was the actual web page. You needed to input some data, specifically your national identity card, your birth date, and the postal code. And with that, the page performed a number of operations that I will explain detail later on. And then it told you where you had to go and to vote, and which was the district and table where you could vote. So what happened then? On the 22nd of September, the High Court of Justice of Catalonia issued other takedown orders to all of these pages, particularly the ones that provided information to be able to perform this referendum, because this referendum was did not respect the law according to the prior referendum law. And what happened next, everybody knows. The Catalan hacktivist community, with very deep historical roots in Spain, and you can read that in Hack Story, helped to disseminate the source code that allowed to replicate the web and a number of instructions for people for non-technical people, just copy and paste of the command so that you could immediately put up in the server a new web page to facilitate access. And what happens again? Well, the High Court of Justice issued several takedown orders to block access to these web pages if they were connected with these websites or all of the domains that were made public by any member. Censorship techniques. Well, I am using the word censorship or the capacities of a censor are defined as attack models in this paper, which I encourage you to read, published in PETS in 2016. And if we look at the attack models described in this article, well, the takedown orders, it's direct censorship, really. You just block in destination. Based on who is the owner of the domain, different things could be done. The filtering techniques used by telephone companies, they did DNS tampering. It's easy to change your DNS. You use Google's or whatever, and that's it. Or you can use VPN, and with that, you can also use deep packet inspection to block HTTP requests. So HTTP GET requests, if they match the dominium that were known to be blocked, then there was no delivery. So what happens is that there's a wait of 11 seconds. So if you waited for 11 seconds, you could retain that. If you retain that order for 11 seconds, then you sent it then, and then everything worked. So censors did nothing but blocking web pages and IPs. So blocking access to information. As for resistance technique to censorship, one censorship-resistant system is a client-server architecture software that involves component interactions to facilitate an unblockable communication between user and publisher. There are two phases in the censorship-resistant system. First, you establish communication, and then there's the conversation. So, by communication establishment, it tries to avoid censorship to get a link and then start a communication or the conversation. But in Catalonia, there was no system as such, but rather technical instructions were given to avoid the blocking of the domain names. So what was the first thing they did? They said, we have to do something to avoid these blocks of all web pages, so they decided to use the distributed files systems. One of the clone web pages announced an IPFS web page, which is an interplanetary file system, which is a distributed file system. It's point-to-point, and the storage can be directed by the content. And the IO point is it's a domain that's in the UK, so not in Spain. So things were harder for the state, and the connection was HTTP. So any man-in-the-middle attack was not viable. Having used IPFS to avoid the block is actually quite a good idea, because it is a peer-to-peer distributed file system, and that means that the content is served by that domain, and can be replicated upon user's request. So the domain blocking is no longer working well, and the storage is possible by content. So any user can know if the information had been modified by looking at the hash, the distributed hash of the information. So this is all very well, but how to educate 5 million people who had to vote on the 1st of October about bypassing censorship techniques? Well, you use the Trump method, you use Twitter, and that's it. And they did the simple stuff. What do? We want to access Mejor Torrent that has recently been blocked, or some other, well, people who do those things, people who download illegal stuff. What do? We go to proxy, which is the cheapest way of getting access to blog pages. That's what they did. And this is the tweet sent by Carlos Puigdemont to inform how from your own home you could access these pages. And this is perfect because this is something everybody should be familiar with. It's important for everybody to know how to use a proxy. So he gave us 3 proxies. You use this one or this one, and then you go here, you click here, and that's it. Another thing that was done in a distributed way beyond the web page was the census. As soon as it was seen that the server that they had, the electoral census, was left in a distributed way, and it is still available in the internet, and I've taken this repository because I think it's a trustworthy author, and I want to take a look at it. The structure of the census is very simple. It's a number of files with extension .db stored in different folders. If you know just a bit, this is hexadecimal. So we have a first val for each file, and within each file there's a number of files, which is the second val of a key, SHA-256, which is calculated with the information of each person. So when you wanted to vote, you introduce certain data, and those were manipulated to generate a key. And that key, it was a SHA-256, which is 352 bytes. So the first one was used for the file, and the rest for the file. Each file was just a long list of lines, and each line had 212 characters, and the first 60 characters are actually the rest of the bytes of that key that I have just referred to, and the other 352 characters were ciphered with a symmetric cryptographic schema, which is the one that contained the information about where they had to go vote. So we have 2 possibilities here, the rooted or the paper. Perhaps the paper one is more convenient. Here we see what they needed to input, part of the identity card, birth date, zip code, and then it gave us in a chain the information about where they had to vote. That input, first of all, was concatenated, and then it calculated 1,750 times SHA-256, and with that it generated a PK key. Afterwards, it went back to cipher, or to take through the hash the PK to get an SK, which is the cells key. And with this key, it found exactly which was the file and which was the folder and which was the file that they had to use.
Luego, para cada línea ya lo que usaba es
And then for each line, There were several files for each line, and here you had to find the last 60 bytes of the key, and the rest was decodified using, as you see here, this 256 with CBC mode and PKC number 7. Okay, some notes about the algorithm. So why these 1,714 iterations? Well, I don't know, because I remind you that a hash function is a one-way function, so it's given a certain input, it's very easy to calculate the output, but if you have the output, it's very difficult to calculate the input. So doing it once or 80, that's fine. You're wasting cycle time. And the value of 1,714, it's probably very likely connected with the date where this particular siege of Catalonia had taken place, and when they were as part of the Spanish succession. And it was 714 because there was one iteration more. The output of what I was saying was a chain separated, a value string separated by this symbol, the voting center name, the address, the specific voting information, etc. I don't know what the rest is. If somebody here knows what it is, I'd be delighted to find out. And here you have an example of a person who has given me the data. I have express consent. I have the Python script, and here we see where I had to vote, and this string that I'm not sure what it is. Probably for the checking of a redundancy. About the algorithm, there's something else I'd like to mention about the key entropy. At the time, there was quite a lot of discussion. If they use the last five last digits and letter of the Spanish identity card, you know that the letter is calculated in this way, so you can compute it. But if you cannot compute it, you have approximately 21 bits in order to save that information. The birth date in the American format, year, month, day. If we take 100 years, we can have this range of possibilities. So that's 15 bits. But this we can fine-tune, but it was not needed because and you can only vote if you're 18 years or older. So, and as to the zip code, you have, it's 5 digits, and the 2 first ones identify the province. So in this case, 4 provinces, and the rest, the other 3 possibilities, give you 11, almost 12 bits. It is true that we can also here zoom in a bit because not all of the values are valid. So if we add all of the bits, we get 48.27 bits, and that's less of what NIST or encrypt institutions recommend to protect against the eavesdropping attacks, etc. There's just 1 minute left. Okay, sorry, you do not have that much time to sleep. So what type of responsibilities can there be derived from what happened in the 1st of October based from what we have both explained? I'm going to go quickly, but later on, if you want, we can go in more in depth. There are 3 types of legal implications since the reform of the Constitutional Court in 2015, the constitutional part and the administrative part. the constitutional. We're talking about coercive fines of 12,000 euros per day, because this is an indirect responsibility for not paying attention to the rulings of the 12th of September and the writs derived from these rulings. But so beyond this express order of not generating these files, and I summarize this very quickly because we don't have time for more, but legal implications, the criminal ones and the liabilities in this case are difficult to determine. Why? Because we have to take one person and analyze the responsibilities in an individual way, and with something very important, which is the evidence of the act that is being attributed to them. And if we go to the criminal sphere, there are many possibilities, direct and indirect, but it is the procedural part of being able to link one crime with one specific person, particularly when we're dealing with the computer world. And here we can see different types of criminal acts, which can range from disobedience to what we're seeing right now during the trial. But we can link this to different criminal types of crimes. When we're specifically talking about liabilities stated on Articles 197 and 198 of the Spanish Code, with sanctions that can range from 1 to 5 years of imprisonment, depending on whether and if they were public servants, they could have ineligibility for 5 years. There's two administrative liabilities of the LOPD, fundamentally connected with the breaching of pretexts such as 6 or 11 or 7 if we are dealing with sensitive cases. We are starting from the principle of illegality, and so there is a liability regarding that action. And that liability, if we turn it into numbers, you can see that it can entail 300,000 to 600,000 euros because it's sensitive information. So if it's proven, for instance, that this data came from the healthcare administration, but it's also important to know that the Spanish Agency of Data Protection in September also talks about the possible personal responsibility of the people who were participating in the electoral tables. And it gives us a figure, and it says in this case the fines could be between 40,000 to 300,000. I think this type of liability is going to be complex to attribute, but to finish and not bore you too much with this part, I want to say that the responsibilities in this case are not so easy to prove or attribute personally, because the Spanish agencies of data protection and the Catalan one were sort of fighting each other. So we can see how there could be a mistake for those people who were at the time participating on the 1st of October. So depending on the administrative trends that we follow, different actions could actually be defensible or not, or different. So I'm not going to keep on talking, but if the General Data Protection Regulation had been in place, that became binding in 2018, perhaps it would be easier to attribute them this liability. And right now, this subject is under investigation, and according to And this has actually entailed the freezing at the administration level, because there is a principle that is called non-discipline. You cannot sanction somebody twice for the same action. So in some cases, to pick up an example, if you get no criminal liability, you can then move on to a civil liability, but otherwise it's impossible. Okay, just to conclude, the Spanish Constitutional Court repeatedly warned about the unconstitutionality of the 1st of October referendum and presumable illegalities of other acts supporting that referendum. The technical considerations, we have already mentioned them, the takedown orders on the one hand, and then distributed database or distributed web pages, and proxy connections. I would like to emphasize that the electoral census was distributed, it was ciphered with low entropy but strong enough to do its job, which is to keep information confidential. So for an attacker with limited resources, no problem, but that's good enough. But for an attacker like a state, not so much so. As to the legal consideration, the basic principles of data protection, legality, purpose and competence have been violated presumably, and there could be criminal and administrative responsibilities. If there are questions, I'll be delighted to take them. So will I.
Podemos una pregunta, así que tiene que ser...
I have a question.
Nos hemos enredado a posta para que vaya bien.
But we've used all of our time to leave no time for questions. Okay, if there are no questions, thanks very much.